Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Heitzen, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started Art of Procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Ryan Flynn to the Art of Procurement. Ryan is a principal at Deloitte Consulting and one of the co-authors of the biannual Deloitte CPO survey. And as regular listeners of the show will know, I've followed the Deloitte CPO survey all the way back to my practitioner days, and it's something that I always relish and anticipate. Deloitte just released their 2021 report, and so today I unpack the findings and we go a little bit deeper with Ryan. This year's report actually focuses on agility, so I start by asking Ryan why agility was such a big finding in the survey.
Yeah, so last time we did our CPO survey, which was in 2019, it focused on masters of complexity, and at the time, that seemed like the right theme given everything that was going on in the world. And then when the pandemic hit, all of that complexity just kind of got thrown into overdrive, I would say, and it became not only important to think about how you master that complexity, but how you became more agile to be able to respond to an event like the pandemic, which a lot of people were calling it kind of a black swan event. But if you go back and look at what some people like Bill Gates and others were saying, prior to it, there were a lot of people who were actually predicting that something like that could happen. Obviously, no one necessarily understood what the full impact of it could be. But these types of events, are maybe not as impactful, are going to keep coming. And so it's not only necessary to be able to kind of master the complexity that's in front of you, but also think further out and how you can be building agile capabilities, to be able to steer around some of these different events that will be coming.
Yeah, and some of those events can be company specific or industry specific, but just the ability to be able to move quickly, I think, is going to be really a big part of the value proposition for procurement.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, you're right. Even with everything going on, we had something as crazy as the ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal, and the impact that had, or rather in the Gulf, and the impact that had on global supply chains, and that was another one that really I think kind of caught people by surprise and had people scrambling to figure out what impact on their organization was going to be, and what they needed to do to try to make sure that they could assure supply moving forward.
Now, in the report, you talk about the expectations of the CPO role having increased. Now, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing from that perspective.
Yeah, sure. So we looked at the different roles that CPOs have been playing, and like a lot of things, with the pandemic, I think that what was already happening just got amplified and is now starting to move at a faster pace. So if you go back to previous surveys, like in 2019, we were saying often that CPOs are getting more and more involved in other parts or other initiatives around the organization to help drive value. It's not just about cost savings. It's about helping to get involved in M&A activity to ensure that that savings that are calculated as part of a merger or an acquisition really get driven down to the bottom line. It's about working with the business to help manage risk more effectively, and also drive innovation. So things were already kind of moving in that direction. And then I think when the pandemic hit, it really made those changes come along faster, because CPOs were being asked to do a lot more to help their organizations respond to
Mhm.
what was going on, and they were getting a lot closer to the operational side, for example, and a lot of people were turning to them in the organization, given the importance of suppliers to help with the response to the pandemic. So I think it's something that really just accelerated that trend that we had seen before the pandemic, and I think it's something that we'll see continue to accelerate even as we start to move on from the pandemic.
Now, as you think about some of those kind of expanding priorities, you're obviously seeing it in the field every day in the work that you do from a day-to-day basis with clients. Do you think some of those priorities are here to stay, or that there's priorities that were perhaps short-term that may drop off the radar again once whatever normality looks like returns?
I think that a lot of them will be here to stay because I think what happened is that a lot of challenges that companies face that weren't necessarily as visible before the pandemic really got laid bare.
Hmm.
I think a good example of that is around something like supply chain visibility, where a lot of companies talked about that before the pandemic. Not a lot of companies necessarily really had very good visibility, into their
Right.
supply chains,
Hmm.
even tier one in some instances. And when the pandemic came around, it really kind of became obvious that they didn't have that visibility,
Right.
and that was a huge problem. And so I think these issues were laid bare so much by the pandemic, and companies did get burned by them. That a lot of initiatives like supply chain visibility, better contract management, for example, because another issue was companies understanding what kind of obligations they had,
Hmm.
not only with their suppliers but with their customers as
Yeah.
well, and being able to quickly catalog that. I think a lot of those, we're seeing now at least, are part of the strategy that companies have moving forward. So I think some of these changes will continue on moving forward, since companies realize that they need to be better prepared for these types of events, or even other events that we had, like we talked about the ship getting stuck,
Yeah.
or the weather in Texas that had impacts on
Hmm.
supplies, or what we're seeing right now with the microchip shortage. These things aren't going away, and so I think companies are going to focus on trying to build more agility and resiliency moving forwards to be able to handle them.
Yeah, and in the short term, something that we see too is a lot of the organizations that there's a lot of industries that were decimated by the pandemic. Where there's a lot of bankruptcies, for example, and now there's this, at least in the United States, a rebound. There isn't necessarily the infrastructure required to support the volumes that come from this rebound because of what happened through the pandemic. So you're starting to see more and more supply and demand imbalances. And I'm not sure that's going to go away. That I can see that being an increasingly important role for our chief procurement officer to really just secure supply as you look over the next 12 to 18 months or so.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's going to be a laser focus on that. It will impact, not just increasing supply through working with your suppliers, but also, thinking about your inventory,
Hmm.
and your overall supply chains, and how do you, build more flexibility and resiliency into your supply chains. Because we went through this period where we got these really efficient global supply chains built, and it really was, a miracle of modern, technology and logistics, et cetera, that we got these, incredibly complex, supply chains to provide this kind of, just in time type of delivery to build goods. But in today's world, I think companies realize that's not going to do it, and they're going to have to adapt, how they operate, to be able to deal with some of these challenges as they come through. I was on a webinar fairly recently, talking about the impact on supply chains. And one of the folks representing a retailer mentioned that they had built a distribution center right as the pandemic hit,
Hmm.
and what they decided to do was to basically turn it into something that wasn't a distribution center, but more of a ability to have redundancy for some of the high moving products that
Interesting.
they had, and they
Hmm.
thought that they would keep that moving forward because they saw the continued need for that shift in how they're operating to be able to deal with some of these issues with assurance of supply that are happening even right now.
Now, I know this is going off at a little bit of a tangent, and I'll come back to a couple of questions on the report in a moment. But just something you said kind of triggered an additional thought is, we've talked a lot about the supply chains, and like you said, they're kind of built just in time. And one crack in the supply chain brings it all down. There was a lot of talk, earlier in the pandemic about, well, this is going to force a nearshoring or an onshoring of supply chains. I just wonder if you're still seeing and hearing that, or whether that was perhaps a knee jerk reaction to we've got to do something differently. And the reality is, you can't just, overnight go from something being offshore to something being onshored or nearshored.
Yeah, I think it's another example of something that was to some extent underway pre-pandemic.
Hmm.
A lot of that was driven by the trade situation that we had in place with China,
Hmm.
and the impact of the cost increases of tariffs and the uncertainty around where that was going. We were already starting to see some companies that were more and more trying to reconfigure their supply chains, reduce the reliance on China. So I think you'll see some more of that. I can imagine probably that countries like Mexico will likely
Yeah.
benefit
Yeah.
from some of those changes. Um, but the other aspect of that is where is the government going to also step in and drive some of that
Right.
more, bringing more of that manufacturing back to the U.S. There's a lot of talk about that these days. Especially I know they're going through a review, but specific industries like developing these microchips, that these are strategic and
Right.
we should be investing in bringing more back to the U.S. So I think some of it will get covered by that. I think some of the continued impact of our relationship with China and rethinking that that's driving some of the uncertainty will also continue to drive changes in how companies are thinking about
Hmm.
supply chains. It may not necessarily be bringing it back to the U.S. as much, but it may be thinking about other parts of Asia
Yeah.
where you can manufacture. And you're right, Philip. It does take time in a lot of these instances, especially for manufactured components to make those changes. So those will take place, over the course of a couple of years. But I do expect things to start moving more in that direction.
Yeah. At least having more diversity in the supply chain.
Yes.
Um, Coming back to the report, when I was looking at kind of the top challenges and top areas of focus for CPOs in 2021, and interestingly, at the top of the list was driving operational efficiency as opposed to reducing cost. And I just wonder if you could share a little bit about kind of the differences, like from a definitional perspective, how you look at and how the respondents looked at operational efficiency versus pure cost reduction.
Sure. Yeah, and that was really interesting. It was the first time in the 10 years that we've been doing the survey that cost reduction was, if you will, kind of unseated at the
Mhm.
top as the focus. I look at cost reduction as something that is really focused on trying to lower spend through supply and demand measures, while operational efficiency is much more focused on the end-to-end process
Right.
and streamlining the process. And this is another thing that I think maybe a situation where some eyes were opened by the challenges that the pandemic brought in terms of reliance on people, and that there's a desire to think about how can you automate more and maybe reduce some of that reliance, particularly on the transactional side. so that you can operate more efficiently, as well as shift some more focus away from, transactional towards more strategic
Hmm.
and value-added activities. So I think that's really the difference. That operational efficiency focus is really geared towards not only the streamlining, but also I think there's a little bit of maybe risk mitigation there by focusing on that process streamlining and automation
Hmm.
versus purely cost reduction. I look at operational efficiency as, in a lot of cases, at the end of the day, driving cost reduction, but that's not the only reason to do it.
Yeah, and not the sole purpose of, and you taking more of a kind of a holistic end-to-end um, lens, I guess, than just looking at something as a transaction over a baseline price versus a price tomorrow, and that being your focus.
Correct.
Um, as we start to look at all the different ways that CPOs and their roles are changing and their responsibilities are changing and increasing, are you seeing that being reflected in their scorecards? The way that CPOs are measured. Um, are we still got some catching up to do? I'd love to know kind of how we're reflecting that value that we're creating in a way that maybe goes beyond, we save this amount of money.
Yeah, I think there's probably some catching up to do. If you look at the survey, that there's a bit of a gap between what CPOs are saying that they're getting involved in, and maybe what's being measured from a scorecard
Mm-hmm.
perspective. A lot of companies are very much focused on measuring savings, and to your point, a baseline versus new piece price,
Right.
as an example, and they don't focus as much on other ways of driving value, as well as kind of non-savings measures as a part of those balanced scorecards. So I do think that it will need to catch up as companies start to have their procurement organizations shift their focus from that pure cost savings perspective and dynamic to more of a value creation dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
and it will start to catch up more. But a lot of organizations are very cost focused, and even as they get more involved in other areas of the business, they're not necessarily measured as much on that involvement. I think they will want to, you know, get to a point where they can try to measure that value as a way to prove what procurement can bring to the table, and we'll start to see more of a shift towards broader balanced scorecards, like you saw with the agility masters in the survey. That was one thing that they did that really stood out, as they had that broader definition of value. I think other CPOs will soon start to follow that example.
Now, as you work with some of those masters and those leaders, are there specific things that they're measuring that come to your mind that's just a little bit different? That might be a little bit more innovative in terms of measuring performance. Really, just to inspire people who are thinking, "Hey, I don't really know how to get out of this model of only measuring my performance on savings."
Well, I think part of it is measurement, and part of it is really driving a mindset change within the broader
Yeah.
organization, and within procurement as well, because we're certainly seeing more companies that are focused on areas like supplier collaboration and supplier innovation that can be hard to measure.
Mhm.
Um, and it's, in those instances, I think it's more about having programs in place where procurement is helping to drive those initiatives around innovation, collaboration, along with the business, really to achieve broader business goals. And that's part of why it can be hard to measure those, because it's not just procurement that you're measuring here. Um, you
Right.
know, these are broader business objectives that procurement is helping to enable. So in those situations, it can be hard to quantify procurement's specific impact in these situations, because they're working with different groups around the organization that are all contributing to the outcome.
Hmm.
And so maybe it's hard to specify exactly what
Right.
procurement's contribution was to that, because they're in more of an enabling role versus a driving role. In the savings instance, they're in the driving role. And I think that the top performers realize that you know it's maybe less about measuring their specific contributions, although you can do that certainly. Maybe not in a very specific way, but you can do that. It's more about that, or less about the specific contributions, and more about helping to achieve those overall business outcomes. And I think
Hmm.
that change in kind of mindset is also critical to being successful with these things. Because if it's purely, you get involved if you can measure it, then maybe procurement's not going to get involved in all
Yeah.
of these different areas.
Yeah. So from a feedback loop perspective, I think it's a challenge is, how do you get credit for that? But on the other hand,
Yeah,
I want to get away from the mindset of thinking you need to be credited for everything, which speaks to
yeah.
what you said. It's a little bit of a catch 22, but thinking about how can you at least be acknowledged to be part of the team, or that the feedback gets to the right people, to know that when they're looking at procurement in its entirety, it's not just a savings number. Whether it's feedback from executives, or whether it's a governance process that brings this to light. How are you seeing procurement teams be able to at least be credited in some way, shape, or form for creating that value without it being a number on a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I really think it's about impact.
Hmm.
And it's about measuring maybe the overall impact of an innovation program, for example, and speaking to procurement's role in that impact without, as you said, measuring that via spreadsheet,
Right.
and putting a specific number to it. I think that's really the key to think about it that way, in terms of the overall impact, and what did you contribute to that impact. That's a better way to consider it,
Hmm.
and be able to have maybe some sort of idea of what kind of value procurement's bringing in this space.
One of the things that was really interesting to me was this notion of how to measure procurement's influence, in terms of quality of influence versus spend under management. We've often gone and said, well, we need to get, I don't know, 90% spend under management, and by doing that means that we get the pat on the back and we're best in class. And nobody ever really challenges what spend under management means. Does it mean that it's contracted, it's going through an e-procurement system,
Mm-hmm.
it's been touched strategically,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that maybe that's not as important as what are the things that we should be touching. And I just wonder how you're seeing that again in the field kind of play out in reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think influence is what drives some of these KPIs that people tend to focus on, um, and some of the KPIs can also maybe sometimes, to your point, mask that level of influence. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you need to start by thinking of influence, and how you build that influence in an organization. How do you build the right level of relationships with the chief HR officer, for example, so that when they think about sourcing benefits the next time, they turn to you for
Yeah.
help in doing that. Same thing with a chief marketing officer, for example. How do you build that relationship, and how does your team build those relationships so that you are getting involved at an early enough point in their life cycle, that you are able to kind of wield that influence. Everything just kind of flows from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important to think of it that way. Not to say that KPIs like spend under management aren't important and good barometers of your success as a procurement organization, but really it is about that influence you can have, and frankly that influence is key to not only the cost reduction that you're working on right now, but also the cost reduction that you're going to need to drive in the future.
Yeah.
And impacting the demand side as well as the supply side.
You know what you said there about impact is really important, because you can pursue a spend under management number that suggests that you have some kind of influence over spend, but focusing on where can you make a biggest difference and where can you make the biggest impact. Traditionally as procurement folks, we've always kind of taken an approach that we got to follow the big numbers, because the big numbers are going to drive the big savings. But actually the big numbers may be very mature categories of spend that are really under control, and that you're in a good spot with them. The impact you can have is in these smaller areas of spend that are actually the future of your organization is going to be built upon the innovations that are generated there. And so it takes you out of that, I got to go for big numbers, to what's going to be the most important things that my company buys over the next 5 years. I'm focusing there.
Yeah, and the concept of savings, is often kind of a backwards looking concept. You look at your historical spend and kind of compare to that where you are. Whereas I think this idea of impact and getting involved in areas like innovation, really is forward looking, and it expands that view of the value you can provide, because now you're not just focused on the spend part of the equation. You're also focused on the top line and helping to grow the top line. And as with most organizations, there's a huge amount of value there as well, that I think procurement organizations can really add to as they get involved and help drive more innovation in organizations. And to your point, that may not be one of the big suppliers that you work with right now. That may be a newer supplier that's bringing something to the table, and ultimately becomes a big supplier for you. So it's interesting that I think that we'll start to see procurement organizations not just focus on those big suppliers, but also start to focus on who are the emerging suppliers that we really feel can add value to the organization, and how do we help the organization work with those suppliers on innovation and on developing those suppliers, so that over time they can grow to become a bigger part of driving innovation in the organization.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity for the top line, for procurement to be involved in and top line growth, and to focus on top line growth that I think we miss sometimes. But I'd love to know your perspective on it. My kind of opinion, and based on my experiences, it's something that it's on procurement to demonstrate the value we can bring to that we can to allow the business to connect our value proposition with top line, because most of the folks in the organization that we work with are just conditioned to think of us as more bottom line protectors. I just wonder if, when you see kind of the masters who are driving top line growth, if that's something that really came from within, as opposed to somebody from outside of procurement looking down and saying, "Hey, I'd like some help in driving top line growth."
I think a lot of it did come from within, and a lot of it came from CPOs who thought, how can I be of more value to the organization beyond just what I'm doing now, given my role in shepherding and managing supplier relationships in the organization. A lot of other parts of the organization that are involved in supplier relationships, they don't have the time necessarily
Right.
to drive those relationships in a way that is going to help lead to greater top line growth through innovation and collaboration. And so I think these CPOs have seen some white space, and I'm seeing it with my clients as well, where they're really starting to focus a lot more on being able to establish innovation and collaboration programs with their top suppliers as a way to expand the value that they're bringing as an organization. And it does take, as mentioned, a change in mindset as well. It's not enough to just kind of build a program and have some of those capabilities stood up. A lot of the behaviors that have traditionally driven procurement in terms of focusing on cost savings, those don't work if you're trying to build strategic partnerships and drive innovation.
Right.
So I think there's going to be focus on that area as well, in terms of trying to build that type of capability, that sort of muscle memory in these organizations, to be able to do both. This is walking and chewing gum at the same time,
Right.
right?
Um,
You're focused on cost savings and delivering
yeah.
that, but you're also focused on helping to drive greater partnerships with key suppliers.
Yeah. The cost savings still exists for a lot of organizations, so that at least they know they're getting a positive ROI from a traditional measure. But you kind of got to do that to have the opportunity to play in the in the innovation space and the driving the top line, rather than it being one versus the other.
Yeah, and it can't be just putting some language in a contract,
Yeah.
around innovation and expectations, and having quarterly business reviews where you're talking with the suppliers about what they've done to bring innovative ideas to you. It's really got to be a very much dedicated program, and it also, I think, has to get elevated to the executive level, at both the organization and at the suppliers,
Mm-hmm.
to really be successful. Because a lot of what we've seen over the years is that the people who run the day-to-day relationships with suppliers, because a lot of it's been focused historically so much on cost reduction, you don't necessarily have that trust built up,
No, the precondition
between the
to
organizations,
yeah
and
to
so you need those relationships at the top and the push from the top to try to build that. It's almost a level of permission to get out of our kind of cost reduction mode,
Mhm.
and build these trusting relationships, so that you can really work together to come up with the ways that you're going to collaborate and drive innovation together.
Yeah, and patience is so important. Again, doesn't happen overnight, because some of those
Yes.
relationships take some time, and so you can't just go live with a program and necessarily expecting 6 months that everything has changed, because you got to rebuild some of that trust with some of your partners.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you've got to be thinking longer term, with some of these programs. It's not gonna happen right away. You're gonna have to keep at it, for a while. Maybe even start kind of smaller. Prove out that you can do it between the two organizations,
Hmm.
and build on that. But you can't make it episodic. You have to continue to work on it. It's got to be a level of dedication on both sides to make it work.
Now, there's a really interesting stat that fascinated me. It was talking about transactional versus strategic work,
Hmm.
and you found that for the kind of typical respondent, typical company, I think the CPOs were spending 74% of their time doing transactional work. But for the top performing and the masters, they were still spending 63% of their time doing what you may class as transactional work, which is kind of a surprising number. But rather than kind of understand why that number is, the question I had is like, is there such a thing as good transactional work? Transactional work that brings value, because they're obviously doing something right, yet still spending a lot of the time on transactional work.
Yeah, this is one that I think is really interesting, and you know, and surprising. And I have a theory about it that maybe some of it may have had to do with the timing of the survey and
Hmm.
CPOs responding in the midst of the pandemic, when everybody was so focused on just kind of keeping things running, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of time to take a step back
Yeah.
and think strategically. So I agree. It was surprising to see those numbers, and particularly for the top performers, spending that much time on transactional work. I suspect that number is a little bit high, um, but I think that if you look at some other areas in the survey, particularly around digital, where you did see the top performers much more likely to be embracing digital, to
Hmm.
be embracing, predictive analytics, AI, things like that. I think that's something where you're going to see these top performers, and I think they already have to some extent,
Yeah.
but start to separate themselves moving forward in terms of reducing the amount of time and effort spent on transactional work, so that they can focus on becoming more agile. And I think supplier risk is a great example. If you look at the survey, I think 75% of CPOs listed collaboration, as a top priority.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, over half were not using, supplier collaboration or relationship management solutions, and that was actually the lowest level of any type of technology solution. So you can imagine, in the midst of a pandemic, if you didn't have great visibility into your suppliers and weren't able to share information as well, you're going to be spending a lot of time and effort to get that visibility and maintain that level of
Right.
coordination.
Now, actually, on the topic of digital transformation, one of the points that you made in the report was that drivers of success in digital transformation are kind of clear flags of that are an enterprise strategy and then procurement
Hmm.
taking a holistic approach. I wondered, is that enterprise strategy to digital transformation, if that doesn't exist, is procurement kind of pushing the boulder up a hill? Or have you seen organizations still be successful in creating a business case for investment in digital transformation where maybe the organization isn't at that, ready for that yet?
It definitely makes it harder to do if you don't have a clear enterprise strategy, around digital. And in large part, companies can develop their own digital strategy and be effective in doing so. I mean, these digital procurement solutions, frankly, have been around for a while, and
Yeah.
they're pretty mature. And so I think the part about deciding what that strategy should be and what to do is not too difficult. It's a path that many companies have paved already, and maybe getting the funding for it without a broader digital strategy behind you might be more challenging.
Mhm.
But I've seen companies do it.
Yeah.
I think the hard part is that you're not gonna, when you execute on it, not necessarily, it's going to be more costly. Um, if you don't have a broader enterprise strategy, and you're not necessarily going to be able to get as much return on that investment.
Hmm.
These solutions, even though, as I said, they're mature and that path has been pretty well paved before. These solutions on the procurement side, they can't live in a vacuum,
Right.
and usually not having a clear enterprise strategy means that there's a lot of complexity in the integrations and the data, and at times also that it's going to be harder to drive adoption because you don't necessarily have that overall company mindset of this is what our digital strategy is,
Hmm.
and people need to be using the solutions. You tend to get a lot more of the maybe kind of an opt out type of culture in organizations
Yeah.
where that company has a very complex landscape because people have been allowed to go off and do their own thing over time. And that's where I've seen clients really struggle in the procurement space. Even if you've got a good strategy, putting it all together in a way that you've got the integrations and the data also set as part of that, not just these procurement solutions, and then that ability to also drive adoption to these new solutions, that becomes a lot harder.
Yeah. Yeah, that ease of integration when you don't have that enterprise level support, I think is really important because you'll often find IT as being a roadblock because they don't have resources. They have other priorities in terms of integrations and implementations. But if it's the easier it is to implement, if you're doing it kind of on your own, means you're not reliant on that resource. When you have an enterprise strategy, it's less of an issue because they've got money that's allocated as well to help assist in those integration efforts.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't have the right level of IT involvement, then it really hurts you because the integrations and the effectiveness of those as designed and built, can really have an impact on the user experience.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes an even greater challenge to drive adoption if those aren't working well.
Now, I want to just spend the last couple of minutes here talking about workforce. There was a big section in the report about workforce and operating models and how you access subject matter expertise from a procurement perspective that I'd really recommend anybody, gets the reports and reads that section. One thing that was interesting to me was the statement about agility masters twice as likely to leverage kind of a hybrid in-house outsource model, bring in on-demand resources versus just a 100% internal make kind of thing. But also, when you looked at full outsourcing, BPO outsourcing versus more of a hybrid model, actually the masters are more likely to use a hybrid model than the full outsourcing too. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to what you see from a delivery model and an access to talent perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's a situation where those agility masters, those top performers, are taking advantage of where the world is going, because we're moving into a much more flexible world where you've got much greater ability to use external partners for project-based support, much greater visibility into supply of contractors, things like that. You've got methods like crowdsourcing that you can take advantage of. So I think we'll see more organizations move to kind of supplement rather than necessarily fully outsource some of these different activities. Particularly in strategic areas like sourcing. Developing sourcing strategies. You'd be able to maybe tap into a set of category experts that will help you to bolster what you have for your sourcing strategy. Instead of having an external partner maybe come in and run the whole thing for you. So I think we'll see more of that. I think we're also seeing the fruits to some extent of greater adoption of transactional solutions like procure to pay that can really automate the end-to-end process more. There's no way to automate it completely, but you can go to a lot greater number of touchless transactions that you have in these solutions. And so that does, I think, reduce that need for outsourcing on the transactional side, where we've seen that outsourcing as much more prevalent on that side transactionally. I think a lot of the masters have already figured this out. Have put these P2P solutions in place, are driving more spend through them, and are enabling more and more of these kind of touchless transactions, so that they don't have that need as much for outsourcing. But just to tie it back to what we're talking about in terms of digital strategy, there's always going to be a need for some of this outsourcing, transactional outsourcing in particular, in part because a lot of companies do have very complex technology landscapes, and it becomes harder and more expensive to standardize, and so you end up kind of throwing people at the problem versus necessarily throwing technology on it. So I think that we'll continue to see a reduction in reliance on outsourcing, and companies more and more will start thinking about how they can maybe augment versus replace.
Now, my very last question, because I could talk to you for hours about delivery models and the future of procurement, and I'm a big proponent of what you talked about before in terms of from a strategic perspective, you're really augmenting with experts and bringing experts in on kind of an as-needed basis, because internally you've got more relational folks as opposed to those that are really deep SMEs. And on the tail spend and the transactional side, it's more how can we outsource or how can we use self-service models. When you looked at the report and when you looked at the data, as you're kind of collating the report, and this is really my last question, was there anything that you looked at and said, wow, I wasn't really expecting that? that really stood out as being a surprise to you versus perhaps what you anticipated?
Not too much. I would say that certainly that focus on transactional work was something that was surprising, and maybe a little bit not maybe disconnected from some of the um, other findings of the survey around where procurement organizations were focusing, because what they said was that they were focusing a lot more on some of these non-cost reduction strategic activities.
Yeah.
So I think that one was kind of surprising. I did find that operational efficiency one maybe a bit surprising, just because cost reduction had been year over year that top view, and with the pandemic, there seemed to be at least initially an even greater focus
Right.
on cost reduction to get through it. So I was a little bit surprised at that, and seeing that, but I would say everything else fit into a narrative that we kind of, as I said, saw going on maybe a bit before the pandemic, but maybe got amplified by the pandemic, and I would expect to continue to get amplified moving forward.
Well, Ryan, I want to thank you very much for your time. As regular listeners to Art of Procurement will know, I always look forward to the Deloitte CPO survey. I've done since the days I was a practitioner. It definitely doesn't disappoint this time around as well. So I'd recommend that anybody who has enjoyed the conversation has an opportunity to go and download it. You can download it easily. Where would the best place for somebody who does want to get a hold of the report? Where should they go?
All you have to do is go into your browser and type Deloitte CPO Survey 2021 in, and it should come up.
All right. Nice and easy. Well, I'm going to include a link directly as well to the survey in the show notes for today's episode. That's going to be artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll find this pod amongst all the others that we have on the site. Ryan, one last time, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes,